Look, I'm gonna cut right to the chase. Rift Apart's PC port is good. It's very good. It's not perfect, it could use some more polish, but that's not why I have to qualify the answer to the question, is it good, with yes, but. Because ultimately, despite the fact that this port is, for the most part, very well put together, I can't lie, I had a rough time playing it. I'm about to heap a load of praise on it, so maybe wait a bit before you send your comment and leave the video. I'll get to that rough time later, but I'd like to first take a look at something good. No, not performance. That is good and I will get to that, but I want to start with something that's not going to feel like a discount Digital Foundry. Controls. You know, if there's anything this port has made clear, it's just how much this series is a shooter above all other genres. Because I really enjoyed playing this with a mouse and keyboard, much more than I do most other third-person action games. So if you were wondering if a DualSense is a requirement to experience this game, no. There are some concessions because of the lack of adaptive triggers and other input methods. You know, some of their functions do have to be emulated in some way if they result in different actions. Some are pretty well done, some less so, but I am generally impressed with how well the gamepad layout maps to a keyboard, and having mouse aim instead of adaptive triggers is a concession I am more than willing to make. If you do have a DualSense though, you're pretty much playing the game exactly the same as on the PS5, with both its benefits and its downsides. But this is a Steam game with full Steam input support, so if you're one of the 3 people on the planet who bought a Steam controller like me, you've got amazing stuff like trackpad camera, you've got gyro aim, you've even got your entire quick select ring mapped to the left trackpad. Even if you don't have this quite frankly weird controller, every input method benefits from Steam input. I'm not even joking when I say this, the ability to either have mouse or gyro camera control makes this the definitive way to play the game. I'm not sure if it's something I ever brought up in my review of the game, but in the modern era, dual analog aiming feels antiquated. Even back in 2021 it did, and more than anything, more than ultra hyper widescreen or ultra epic amazing ray tracing or higher than 60 frames performance, that's what makes this port worth your time. It might seem simple, and in a way, it is. Steam input wasn't developed by Nixes, but they did set up proper Steam input support with integrated game actions, including a gyro camera action, which means you don't have to hack your way around emulating the joystick for gyro if you don't want to. Unfortunately, you can't use Steam input and the adaptive triggers at the same time. Steam input does use them, but only to differentiate between a soft and a full pull of the trigger, and enabling Steam input completely bypasses all adaptive trigger functions in the game, and treats it like any other controller. It's a little frustrating to have to choose between adaptive triggers and gyro control when both work on one controller, but ultimately I ended up using keyboard for the majority of the time anyway, and I suspect that the problem is more with Steam input not supporting it, rather than the port itself. However, even if it's not possible, I feel like there's more improvements that could have been made to work around this. Having actions for weapon primary and secondary fire states, instead of just one for fire weapon, while it wouldn't apply universally, would have gone a long way in alleviating the gap between the DualSense and other input methods, because that's all it usually boils down to, is just a primary and secondary fire. Many secondary actions are mapped to the right click or left trigger buttons, but that's also used for aiming, which means some actions, like activating the aiming reticle on thrown weapons or spinning up the barrel of the Black Hole Storm, can't be done without limiting your peripheral vision and movement. It would also have been nice to have the ability to have individual quick select wheel items as Steam input game actions, as currently that feature is exclusive to the keyboard. You have actions for the 4 shortcuts, but doing something similar with the quick select itself requires emulating keyboard input, which means you have to give up analog movement controls. That's because you can't use multiple input methods together. Attempting to do so causes them to both fight for control, which makes them unusable. I find most games don't like doing that, so it's not a problem exclusive to this port, but I do wish it was possible. In fairness, I wouldn't have ever been bothered by this if all of the keyboard mappings were available within the Steam input integration itself, so that might be an easier fix for this, but either way, you are limited in some way in what controller configs you can make, which is a shame. With that being said, I think I've run out of things to talk about in regards to input, so it's time we move on to performance, or at least the performance that I had. I'll be totally honest, I expected not to be able to play this game without dropping the graphics settings to the lowest preset and the resolution to 1080p or possibly lower. I am technically above the recommended spec. Before you leave a comment, yes, I'm aware that this is a kinda odd processor heavy rig. That's because this is an editing and development rig first and a gaming rig second. And also because I recently just upgraded pretty much everything except for the graphics card, both because of that first point and also because I'd like to be able to afford to eat this month. But it's only above the recommended spec by a very small amount, and typically recommended is for 1080p at somewhere between 30 and 60, whereas my typical target is 1440p with frame rates in the hundreds. Now, can I get above 60 at 1440p on a 2060 Super? God no, at least not without resolution scaling. Medium-high settings was typically between 40 and the mid-50s, usually around the lower end of that, and it could drop even to 30. With resolution scaling and DLSS to make that resolution scaling less gross, it jumps to around 55 to 70 and even got as high as 90 in some lower detail locations. I was actually rather impressed by how good resolution scaling combined with DLSS looks, even without DLSS 3, which my hardware doesn't support. You can tell, absolutely, it's not a magic solution that adds FPS with no cost, but in my opinion, the trade-off is well worth it, and it makes the support very playable on cards as relatively middling as mine. If you want performance metrics on ultra settings, or to know how many houses you'd need to remortgage to be able to get ray tracing enabled with playable frame rates, this isn't the place. What's important to me is that even at the lowest graphical settings, the game looks decent, and it can look pretty great medium to high. I get that part of the fun of PC gaming is how much you can crank visual details, but I think it's worth addressing that you really don't need to. Games should still look good even when you lower the settings a bit, and if they don't, that should be a problem more than how optimized the highest settings are. Art direction, composition, lighting, those are what makes this game look good, and you don't lose out on that with lower settings. I don't want to say that they're unimportant, it definitely does not look as good at minimum settings. All I'm trying to say is that this game looks great even when it's not rendering every strand of hair and every incidental light ray, and you shouldn't feel shame for having to run at lower settings because you also wanted to be able to afford food this month. With all the flashy graphics out of the way, I'd like to get to the main next-gen feature this game was built around: loading, or the perceived lack thereof. Now, does it load as fast as a PS5? No, it doesn't. But the direct storage API gets damn close, very close with the NVMe SSDs, and hard drives are not as far behind as you might assume. My experience on SSDs is that load times were just longer enough to be noticeable, but as soon as you noticed that it was taking a bit longer to load, it'd finish loading. That being said, direct storage does seem to come at more of a performance cost compared to whatever the PS5 calls its direct drive access API, but it never felt too intrusive. The game really only uses it during very obvious non-interactive transitions. It's during rift transitions to other planets or crystal transitions to another dimension. It's not like it's happening during the middle of a fight. Well, it is, but yeah, you get what I mean. The only place it seems to actually affect gameplay was during grind rail sections, which have a hint of lurchiness when switching dimensions. It's something that affects more how it feels than how it plays, as what were very smooth transitions on the PS5 aren't quite so here, which makes you feel almost like you're stopping for a second when you transition. Even if you only have a hard drive, which I get, most of my Steam library is on spinning discs, it's far more reasonable than I expected. You can tell, it's not as good as an SSD. Load times are longer in all places, but not by a huge amount. Crystal transitions are not nearly as magic as they are with SSDs, there's clearly a pause for loading, but they actually seem to only be this slow the first time you hit them. Subsequent teleports seem to be pretty respectable, although that might vary with lower memory configurations, I'm not sure. If you've only got a hard drive, you're not going to miss out on seamlessly moving between worlds, it's just not quite as magical as it was on the PS5. It's not a very big game, relatively speaking, so if you do have an SSD I would recommend playing it on that, but you're probably safe to transfer it onto your hard disk once you've done a full playthrough, which is probably what I'm going to do. Let's move away from performance for a second, because it's time to talk about stability and bugs. Which, there are bugs. There will always be bugs, especially on release when you're porting a game with presumably a much smaller budget and both money and time compared to what was spent to first develop it. If you're a developer and you haven't shipped a bug into production, you're lying. I've done it, you've done it, just stop lying to yourself. Which is why my standards for quality for bugginess are they triggered by things that most people would do? Do they happen frequently? If so, do they get in the way of playing the game, and will you fix it? In the category of non-frequent bugs that seem like most people could encounter, I found quite a few. Tooltips sometimes stayed on screen for too long, music sometimes didn't properly restart after death, the Magna boots did some funky stuff a couple of times, sometimes the hover boots didn't want to pump and I fell through the floor once, so yeah, there's a fair amount more polish that could be done here. Other than that falling through the floor one, which was definitely a soft lock, nothing really got in the way of playing the game. It could, and you might argue should be better, and that's probably reasonable, but most of what I encountered that you're likely to encounter is pretty simple to work around, if you need to at all. Yeah, it's not perfectly polished. There needs to be some patches released, and they've already started doing so, but on the whole, it's 100% playable, as long as you don't mind having to restart from the last checkpoint once or twice during a playthrough, is what I would say if the game wasn't so unstable. As much as I'm excusing bugs, I cannot excuse the stability. My game crashed so much it's almost comical. In my just under 6 hours of gameplay I did for this video, I had 30 crashes, which is an average of once every 10 minutes. Obviously it was more sporadic than that. Sometimes I go a full hour without any crashes, sometimes I get 3 in 5 minutes. Most of them were full software closes, but I had a handful of lockups as well. Going down the rabbit hole of trying to fix it was pretty inconclusive. Turning off things like NVIDIA Reflex and DLSS seemed to just replace the complete crashes with lockups, and maybe they were less frequent. It's hard to tell, I was nearing the end of the game when I did, so I can't really be sure. Could I live without those settings? I mean, sure, I don't need Reflex, but without DLSS in particular, it's very apparent how much the game has to drop resolution to maintain its frame rate, and either way, I'm still not sure if they were actually the cause. The time between crashes was so varied I could have just gotten lucky. You might find it to be entirely stable, and maybe it was more stable when I turned off those settings, but I can't guarantee that fact. My best guess is that they contributed, but they aren't the main cause. Apparently the port also has memory leaks, and that seems to describe what I experienced more accurately than graphics settings. You might think that me being so harsh on the stability is counter to me being less harsh on the various bugs I encountered, but crashes are on a whole nother level than minor bugs. Remember that standard I have? Does it get in the way of playing the game? They get in the way of playing the game, and the only reason I got so far through the game before I gave up entirely is because of how frequently the game autosaves. Even if I could find a config that was stable, I shouldn't have to find it. It's a whole different story to turn on settings that might not be stable, but I had crashes with default settings. If it's a graphics setting that's causing this, and not just a memory leak like I suspect, it was considered stable enough to be on by default when that clearly wasn't the case. That's why my answer to whether or not this port is good is yes, but. Because it is good. And as much as I want to say it's probably fine, that I must have done something wrong, that I misconfigured something, and as much as the comments probably will blame me for this, I can only speak for the experiences I had, which I can only summarize as half-hour intervals of a really good time with a couple of issues, followed by frustration and anger as the game decided it would much rather have me look at my Steam library instead. I want to wholeheartedly say that this port is good and you should buy it, because I want to encourage them to do it more, to make more ports, and there's a lot to like about this port. It's just as customizable as any other PC game and graphics and input. It runs decently if requiring resolution downscaling to reach 60 and above on, not insane hardware, and keyboard and mouse has quickly become my favourite way to play this game, with gyro control a close second. But it's with the caveat that for me, it wasn't nearly stable enough, and it might not be for you either. I only recommend you buy this if you're okay with the concession that it's possible it'll crash a lot, which you might deem to be unlikely depending on what other people's experiences end up being. I hope that's the case. From my experience though, I can't wait for the patches because aside from its stability, this is a damn good showing of a PC port.